Okay, everyone, I think we'll get started here. We might have a few more people join as we go, but that's okay. So I'll start out. My name is David Valade, and I am the VP of Services over at Alta Vista Tech. I've been working with GP since right around year 2000. Actually, I think 1999 I first started with it. And my background's in accounting, and I'm pretty technical, so I do a lot of coding, actually, server side and client side. So I've been around GP for quite a while. Terrible picture of me, but that's okay. So anyway, we're going to cover today some of the tips and tricks and reminders for year-end. So GP year-end is actually pretty forgiving by and large. It's not too difficult, but since it's something we only do once a year, the goal of this meeting here today is just to have a reminder of some of the things that we've seen in the past, just what to look out for, some good tips and tricks, just to file away. I should say that this slide deck that you'll be seeing here today is going to be available for everyone who is attending here today to take with them. So if you can drop me an email, or again, Valerie is our Director of Marketing, you can drop her an email as well, and we'll make this available after. There'll be some links online if you need to get information on that. Okay, so my first point for how we should proceed is when we're closing the year in GP, it is pretty forgiving, like I said, but the order that we proceed in does matter. So this is the recommended order of operations that Microsoft has us follow. You can see them listed here. They would have us do inventory first, followed by receivables and payables, fixed assets, and then general ledgers last. Payroll is its own beast, so if you're running payroll within GP, it really has its own calendar. There's some things you'd want to consider in conjunction with when you would close your general ledger, but you can largely operate independent of those other subledger modules. So not so bad. So I'm going to talk about the different steps here. In general, these are the typical things that we will do for each subledger. So whether we're talking about inventory, payables, or receivables, these are the typical steps. Obviously, this will be a little different, a little variation for each subledger module, but you get the idea. So what we're generally going to do is we're going to make sure we have all of our transactions posted for the prior year. Makes sense. We're going to print any relevant records to a file. You can print them to paper. Obviously, it's a lot easier if you print it to a file and then move it off to, archive it somewhere on your network or back up to your offsite storage. So maybe that's a trial balance. What is the relevant record? Well, it depends what subledger we're talking about. In the case of payroll, that might be some pay journals. For receivables, it might be a trial balance, those types of things, just to have for retention. Making a backup just in case, always a good practice. If you read the Microsoft recommendations, they'll have you backing up every step of the way, which sounds like overkill until you need it. So I never contradict Microsoft. They say back it up, so I do. Closing periods, and then closing the year for the subledger. And again, Microsoft being backup crazy would have you do a backup right then after you've completed that step, which is a little bit of overkill, so we mark it as optional, but those are the tips that Microsoft would have us follow. So let's move on, and I'm actually going to talk about each subledger and just talk about the different tricks. So if you follow my screenshot here, inventory is the recommended first step. So this is what the window, all of these year-end closing windows are located under the routines menu. So in the case of inventory, that would be under the GP routines, and there's an option called year-end closed. If I do this, I have a couple checkbox options, that you can see are there for me. For example, removing discontinued items. If I have an item that I've flagged as discontinued, I can check the box, and then part of my year-end close will remove those items, archive it. You still keep the history, it's just the master item number is not there to be accidentally picked going forward. Sold lot attributes, this is a good one. So if you had a lot number that you're tracking, assuming you are tracking lots, not everyone is, but if you are, if you brought in a lot into inventory and you fully sold it, you no longer have it, GP will actually keep the history of that lot around, so you can go back and look at old transactions. Well, I guess you could do that anyway, but just basically remove the layers for that lot. So it's a housekeeping step. By checking that box, we remove any kind of lot activity we had for something that is fully sold, that's no longer around. This is a good trick. If you are tracking lots and you check that box, then you're not going to hurt anything where you actually do have inventory for lots. Those are fine. But anything that's been fully sold gets cleaned up, which makes a lot of the other reporting that you do for inventory run that much faster. And then there's some sold receipts and cost changes in history. So I'll go through the checkboxes here. And the standard cost update, that's another checkbox option too. So what happens with inventory? We summarize all our current quantities and costs. There's a few reports that show a beginning quantity. I'll show you an example of one in a moment. We update that beginning quantity. Quantity sold gets set to 0. And a couple things with purchase receipts that we already talked about get cleaned up. And that last option there, items update the item standard cost, only applies if we're using a periodic valuation method for inventory. If we check that, then we update that current cost. So, a couple steps. I wanted to show what would happen with an example of what gets updated. The second bullet point here about the beginning quantity is updated. There's a report. It's a core GP called the turnover report. And if you look at this report, I did a screenshot here. You can see there's the number of receipts, quantity received year to date, and then some other quantity sold year to date, number of turns year to date. This is under the inventory analysis reports options. So if this is a report that you use, or there's a few reports that are similar to this, by closing your year, that's what updates, that zeroes out our quantity sold year to date. That's what starts our beginning quantities for our calculations going on. I have some customers who are not very religious about closing certain subledger things, and like I said, GP's pretty forgiving on most counts. So if you never use this report and you just flat out forgot to close your inventory, it wouldn't be the end of the world. There would be some reports that are around that would not be right, but every case is different. So I would always recommend that you do close it to make sure that you may not be using this report today, but you may in the future, and you'd want it to be accurate when you get to that point. So closing year, obviously, good best case practice. We always want to do that if we can. Okay, inventory, pretty basic. Move along. Receivables, again, pretty straightforward option. If we have a December fiscal year end, we have a checkbox option to say close both our fiscal and calendar years at the same time. And if we have a different fiscal year end, then we would only pick the calendar year and then make sure we come back around for our fiscal year end to check this box as well. So for receivables, what actually happens? That's why would we do this? I'm showing here a customer summary, and you can see there's a few options here. There's a year-to-date set of fields here, column right here for this customer that I happen to pick out of my Play company. There's last year life-to-date. I can also show my summaries of amounts since last closed. So just like it sounds, if I don't close timely, then these numbers can be off. Would the customer know that? No, the customer would have no idea. Would my receivables be wrong? No, your receivables would be fine. Would this affect my general ledger in any way? No, it would not. So again, this is the consequence of not doing this in a timely manner. Your year-to-date, your last year, your amount since last closed could be skewed, can be a little bit off. So we do want to make sure that we run this as close to the end of the year as possible, posting all the transactions we can for the prior year as much as we can. I mentioned earlier that with every one of these subledgers, we do want to print off our reports to a file. This is a good time to print out an age trial balance. I like to run this for the year just so we can have that on file. If there's ever an audit or if there's ever been a disaster or anything, we can always go back and look at that. And that's a good candidate for off-site retention. It's a good thing to move off to keep. So I'll move along from this. There's a couple other points I'll make about all subledgers in general as we go. Payables, you're going to see a recurring theme here. Here we have the very simple option, very easy. Just say all fiscal year or, all fiscal or calendar. Same idea as before. If we know who we are, if we have a different fiscal year end, we'll pick the appropriate choice. There's going to be a report that's going to kick out here, and I like to run this to a file. GP actually has gotten better. I'll make a point here for both payables, receivables, and general ledger. You can see here I have the last closing date. Now my Play company, I've never closed the year, so I don't see a date. In prior versions, older versions of GP, you could click that Close Year button, and this window would stay on screen, and it would very subtly update the last closed year, so you'd see that year move up by 1. So I always used to caution people, be very careful, close the year, only click at one time. Be very careful not to click it multiple times because you're going to try to close the next year and then the next year, and you could cause trouble. But these days, like I said, GP's gotten better in that regard, so when I hit Close Year, this window will go away. And the next time I launch it, I'll see the year that I closed last, and that'll prevent me from accidentally closing the wrong year. So pretty straightforward. Same type of thing here. If I close out my payables, what gets updated? Well, I have a few things. I have these windows here that show on the left here, you see a vendor credit summary that's under our cards menu. And there's a period and a yearly button at the bottom of that window. If I click yearly, I can see the amount since last closed, my year-to-date information last year. These are the fields that get updated when I close my year. So everything in this year-to-date column is going to be copied over to the last year column, and the year-to-date column is going to be blanked out. That's really what it does. Common question that we get for vendors, what about W-2s? Sorry, W-2s. What about 1099s? That too. So our 1099s, we can still make edits to that even before closing. I don't mind doing that ahead of time if that's an option. Like if I can go in and I can start, as the year's winding down, going through my edit list of my 1099 vendors and making sure, like basically you can print your 1099s at any point throughout the year. Print them to a file, print them to a screen in a report, scan through that, and just make sure that that looks accurate, make any kind of corrections that you need to make. You don't have to. You can always go back and do that after you close the year. But in a perfect world, I would do that. That way all my numbers are nice and clean. All my 1099 amounts that you see right here in my year-to-date is nice and clean. Like here you see this amount. And then it'll move over to the next year once I close out. So if you find an error, find a mistake after the fact, it's not game over. You can still correct the 1099 before you print it out. So that's okay. And if you're on a newer version of GP, we these days can print a 1096 report. So the older versions of GP didn't have that. I used to complain about that every year, but that is now a core product. So if you haven't looked recently, if you've just been on autopilot with your 1099s over the past few versions, you in the old days used to have to print a report to the screen to see what those totals were for your 1096. That's the form that you give to the government, the summary of all of your 1099s. Now your 1096 prints out automatically. It doesn't print the form. Same thing with the 1099. You have to put the form in the tray, but it will line up to fit the form. Part of our maintenance, part of our updates that we get, the service packs ensure that fact. So if there's ever a change to the approved form from the IRS, we'll fit into that form just fine. So again, if I reiterate steps here, so I'd want to post all my transactions, print my each trial balance to a file. In this case, I might do a vendor period analysis report. It's another one I like. Print these all to file, do my 1099 edits if I need it, and then close my year. Okay. So if I'm walking through this, I just closed my receivables. I just closed my payables. What's next? If we're running fixed assets is next on the list. This window looks different from the other ones that we've seen to this point because here I have some choices on which books I want to close, internal, tax, and so on. If I'm not on a December year-end calendar, I would wait to close that until the appropriate time. But the federal, AMT, any other tax books that I have, I can insert them. I can insert more than one at a time, and then click the Continue button up on the Actions pane, and I can close those out. So fixed assets is a little different here, so I want to make sure I have all my assets entered in for the prior year. I'm going to run my reports. There's a couple reports for fixed assets that show all my additions. I like to run those to a file as well. This would obviously come after I've run my depreciation for the year. So finish my last period's depreciation for that book. And once I've done that, now I'm ready to go ahead and run this year-end close. Now I still can add assets for prior periods as well, but again, we're talking best practices here. It's close, if I've already closed my payables, if I've already done those extra steps, I probably have a pretty good handle on what needs to be capitalized. But if not, I can add them after, or I can wait on this. This doesn't have to happen the very last day of the year. I can always wait several weeks into 2015 before I come back around. That's totally fine. Which brings me to the biggest one here. So this is probably most of the time remaining in our little talk today is going to be about the general ledger. So if you are running a current version of GP, meaning 2013 R2, they've added a new button here that's a lifesaver for us, reverse historical year. So if I close my year and I made a mistake, or I closed it and something went wrong, or there's some reason why I can't do that, why I can't have closed it, but I closed it too soon. It used to be a great big effort to undo that. These days, not so bad. I have a button here to reverse the historical closing. If you're on an older version of GP like 10, or I believe even 2010, this button will not be there. So my whole goal when I'm closing the year is to make sure I don't even need it. So there's a couple tricks I'm going to show here. So let's talk about what happens when we close the year. GP has a checkbox option that lets us post to the most recently closed year, which means once we close 2014, and then let's suppose I get a proposed adjusted journal entry from my auditor. They say, you need to book this entry, make an additional accrual, let's say, for 2014. And I say, oh no, I just closed it. I don't have to reverse that historical year closing, actually. I can go in, and there's a checkbox option to prevent this, but as long as my period's open and this checkbox option is that allows me to post to a historical year, I can go in and backdate my journal entry, make my entry back in 2014, and that's fine, and it'll make the entry. GP will actually also make any sort of retained earnings correction that might be needed as part of that entry. So if I were making an accrual where I'm crediting a liability and debiting an expense account, you don't have to worry about also closing that manually to your retained earnings. GP will automatically do that. So that's good news. The bigger deal is, I mentioned kind of quickly there, when we close the prior year, GP will prevent us from, well, I'm sorry, let me say it again. GP will allow us to post to the most recently closed year, but not prior, because the thinking is that if we post to, let's say, 1998, that means all my balance sheet entries or retained earnings entries every year thereafter would be updated, which would be too confusing to maintain. So the bigger deal, I think, is when you close 2014, you can't go back to 2013. And for most of us, that's okay. Just check with yourself to make sure, maybe you're going through an acquisition or there was something in 2013. It's off limits at that point. Once you close 2014, you can't go back prior to that year. Also means that once you close 2014 on the GL, you can't go back and put in, let's say, a credit memo to a vendor or book a payable to a vendor. I know we talked about those sub-ledgers previously, but this is really it. Once you close the general ledger, that's it. So you can still do a general journal entry accrual, but you won't be able to make any sub-ledger changes for prior years. Again, that's probably okay for most of us. Like, we can do the accrual. That's all right. We can have a reversing entry that backs out in the current year. That's all good. So typically, not a problem. We can get through that. So anyway, just as long as you know what it's doing, then you can be prepared. Now I'm going to share with you all here like the single #1 support case I get as part of year end. And some of you who've been through a few year ends might know that this is something to be careful about. Typically, we don't add new GL account numbers every day, but it's not uncommon to add a handful every year. As your business changes, as you add new product lines, as departments shift perhaps, maybe you add a new location, you may add new account numbers to your chart of accounts. And when you do that, there's this part I've circled here, the posting type, whether this is a balance sheet account or a P&L account. And if I were designing this window from scratch today, I would not make that be a default. That's like a drop down where you would have to pick one. But the way it's engineered is a radio button that defaults to balance sheet. And what that can mean is that you can make a new account number this year and you set it up just fine. You add it to your reporting, whether you're back on FRX or these days on Management Reporter. You add it to your income statement where you need it to be. Everything's happy. You're moving on. You're using the account. You're posting to it throughout the year. Everything's going fine. But unbeknownst to you, the whole time, that account has been set up with this toggle on the posting type set to balance sheet incorrectly, let's say. If that were true, the whole year you're using it, you'll never have any symptom that there's a problem until now. Now when you go to close your year, if this were incorrectly set as a balance sheet account instead of a P&L account, it won't close out to retained earnings, and that causes trouble. So if you jot down this KB number, 864913, or get the slide deck from us afterwards, you can file this one away. There is a KB out there that Microsoft has issued to tell you if you find an account that you had set up incorrectly and then you close your year, there is a pretty not hard set of steps that you would go through to fix it. It's not hard, like I said, but you want to be very careful because now you have to do a couple things to basically you disable posting to history and a few things, and you don't want anyone else to be posting at the same time. So even though the steps are not so hard, logistically it can be difficult because you have to prevent other users from posting anything while you're making your correction. So here is, when it's time to close the year, here's the easiest way to get around this error, or prevent this error from happening. Right before you're ready to close, go into the smart list, and this is a smart list, default smart list, everyone has this. Go into your financial folder and click on accounts. And nice and easy, you'll see a list of all your accounts with the posting type. It's a default column. This is the default view you would get if you were to go to the smart list. And it by default sorts by our account number, which is usually good. But here I can just scan down that smart list to scroll all the way down and make sure I don't see a balance sheet account where it shouldn't be. Now, if I wanted to, I can even hit the little search button up on the toolbar here, and I can add some filters to say where my main account segment is within a certain range or between two numbers. And then show me just that list, and then I can scan down the posting type and just see, okay, do I have any balance sheets where I shouldn't? Or the reverse, a P&L account where it should be a balance sheet. But for most of us, if our chart of accounts are structured where, typically, assets start with have an account number that starts with the 1, liabilities 2, equity 3, so on and so on. The rest are P&L. For most of us, you can just really just scan down the list pretty quickly, and you'll spot anything that's a problem. And then you make your correction. Just actually, this smart list, as we all know, you can double-click on any line item there, and it'll open up that account maintenance window. And you can make the change, and then you're fine. So it takes literally seconds to do this. But if you do that before you close, it can save you hours and hours of hardship after. So highly recommended. You can do that. Okay, this is the title of this class is Tips and Tricks, or class, this webinar. So one other tip that I like to do is, as we're getting down the home stretch, we're going to start closing periods. Not everyone knows this, but if you go to the fiscal period setup, this is the window that you see on the left here. You can pretty easily pull up your year and tick the little checkbox to close or to prevent activity for any given module in any given period. Easy. We do that a lot. Makes sense. You'll also be coming into this window to set up your new year. So when we get to 2015, you'll be typing 2015 if you haven't already, and that'll make the new period show up. Not so bad. Pretty easy. But here's the tip part. If you click on that Mask Close button, you get this other window that shows up called Mask Close Fiscal Periods. I hate the wording on that button, Mask Close. That doesn't tell me much. I don't know. If I didn't know better, I'd be afraid of that. I don't know what that means. But if you do click it, you'll see the window that you see on the right here. So not everyone knows this, but you have the option, instead of just checking the financial checkbox for a period, you can actually hit that Mask Close button, and on the right here you can see I can actually close bank deposits, bank transaction entry, bank transfers, currency revaluations, and so on. I can close out any one of those little subcomponents without closing all of that module. So I may want to leave financials open so that I can make correcting journal entries, but I'm nervous that one of my clerks might accidentally post a bank transaction for that same period. Well, I can control that. I click the Mask Close button, open it up, poorly named Mask Close button, open that up, and I can just tick the boxes that are applicable on the right here. Now, once I am fully done with that period for that series, I can just check the box on the window you see on the left, and that closes everything, and that's fine. But there's another option. You don't have to do this, but part of the year-end closing process is just making sure we get the right entries in the right periods, and this is a little trick you can have up your sleeve so that you can be ready for it. Okay, so file that away. Good one. Now, I mentioned GL for a lot of this. I will mention payroll in passing here. We do have a lot of information about payroll this year in particular. Not everyone's running GP payroll, but if you are, this year is interesting because of the Affordable Care Act, or what we call Obamacare. There's several new reports that are available that are going 1094C, 1095C, as well as a few new fields that are added to the employees and the employee dependent windows, so that you can track different safe harbor codes and different health insurance statuses for your employees and their dependents. That's really a whole topic unto itself. So what I did for this talk today was a couple links. One, I put in a link here if you want to jot down just that KB number 850-663. That is the steps that we have, as with any year, for closing out payroll for GP, so we can print our W-2s and so on. That's, if we've been through that before, that ought to look familiar once you see it. It's just the typical events of what order you go through. This can happen before or after the GL being closed. It really is independent of that. Or, because this year is different with the whole Affordable Care Act, we do have a little post on our site, altavistatech.com, where you can go and click on the little blog up on the navigation pane, and you'll see some posts with a ton of links that we have to explain everything. So please visit the site if you'd like, and you can get more information on payroll. Okay, just 3 more minutes here left in the meeting, so wanted to close on a couple things. Here are my list of gotchas. So I mentioned probably the biggest one I get is what we talked about already with that whole balance sheet or P&L setting on the chart of accounts. That's far and away the one thing you need to be careful about. But if I had to make a list of what are my top 4 other things that I might get, this is my list. So these are the other support topics I tend to get. First is a message that you get from GP saying batches cannot be posted while the year-end close is in progress. Some of you might have seen this. What this means is that someone has an orphaned activity record, which might mean someone was posting something and power interrupted or they closed their session or something happened. So GP doesn't know that you're done with that. And you might have recovered it and moved on, but there might still be that orphan lock that's out there. And so GP, when you go to close, will say, wait a minute, you can't close because someone's still busy doing something. Well, if we're sure that's the case, there's a fix I have right here. There's one table that we need an IT person to delete. We want to make sure that other folks are logged out so we don't incorrectly delete an actual bona fide activity record, but we can do that. So funny story, I once was on site somewhere, and it was over Christmas. We were printing out W-2s, W-2s for payroll, and it was, I think, Christmas Eve. It was, no one wanted to be in, but we're all working. And someone thought, you know what, we ought to have a nice festive day since we're all working so hard on Christmas Eve. Let me go plug in the Christmas tree and unplug the computer as it was printing out W-2s, and just to plug in the Christmas tree lights, and just made the day that much longer accidentally. So, but we knew what to do, and we got through it and had a happy ending. But file it away. There's this one table that we can clear activity against if everyone's logged out, if we do have something that is a batch that's locked. Another message is very similar to this is, sorry, another user is closing the year. This is more like when we're closing the year and power goes out, like if we tried to close the year and something happened. There's a separate table that we rarely look at, but if we run this delete GL 50100 against the company that we're closing, that'll clear that activity flag and let us proceed. And this gets to that larger point that Microsoft would have us do a backup quite a bit, because sometimes restoring that backup might be the easiest course instead of trying to clean up the table, but so be it. It's case by case. As long as you know what your options are, you can choose accordingly. I won't read all this, but I'll point out this last one here. GP's gotten better about this, but I've used to see where we would get people asking us, they'll say, hey, the system is locked up when it gets 50% complete. So GP notoriously has a few different little progress thermometers that go to 50% and just stay there. But I can go on the IT side on the server, and I can look and I can see in a process monitor that SQL Server is crunching along very, very happily. It's just moving along just fine. But the user is none the wiser. They just see 50% done. Yikes, it must be locked up. Worst thing you could do in that case is try to end task or bail out of GP, even if it's taken a few minutes. It's probably not locked up. In older versions, I've even seen like the screen go white, like you try clicking elsewhere in the screen, and the people think, oh, that's it. It says not responding. It's done. Well, it is working. The not responding part is that the client-side application is waiting for a go-ahead from the server. The server is crunching along just fine. So don't do that. So if you get this, looks like I'm closed, it says I'm 50% done, it's been that way for like 5 or 6 minutes, I wouldn't necessarily assume that it's stuck. We could do some checking to find out. You can look for a process monitor, you can see if there's any activity, or if in fact something really did stop. But again, if we have backups, we have something to fall back on. But I would not just end task just to do it. So that's why not just anyone should be, you don't want to turn this over to any user in the company. This is something we do very carefully, closing the fiscal year. So all that being said, that was my whirlwind tour of some tips and tricks, reminders for closing the year in GP and Microsoft Dynamics GP. few different links there, some phone numbers. So if you do have any questions coming away from this talk today, feel free to call into one of our offices or drop us an email. You can also email me directly. There's my dvalade@altavistatech.com address. Feel free to drop me a note if you would like additional information, or if you need a hand just getting through the year. So happy to help in that regard too. So with that, I think we're going to close up the webinar here today. I do have a recording that I'll make available if I at all can. And good luck everyone within the year, and let us know if there's anything we can do to help. Appreciate the time. Thanks everyone.